A heavily armed intruder steps into the frame of a security camera at exactly 2:12 in the morning. But in his frantic rush to escape the area, the suspect dropped the very item designed to conceal his identity. They braced themselves for the inevitable chaos and destruction they assumed they would find waiting for them on the other side of the heavy front door. As the dedicated investigative teams prepared to meticulously process the interior of the home, a massive piece of crucial information broke across the police communication channels. The true identity of the missing victim was officially verified, and it instantly transformed this quiet local mystery into an explosive national media spectacle. Nancy Guthrie was not just an anonymous elderly resident living a quiet retirement in the Arizona desert. She is the mother of Savannah Guthrie, the incredibly famous and highly visible anchor for the NBC News Network. This single, explosive, confirmed fact changed absolutely everything about the operational tempo of the entire case. The local sheriff's department was suddenly thrust directly under the blinding spotlight of national television networks and relentless digital media outlets. Every single investigative decision, every collected piece of physical evidence, and every public statement would now be fiercely scrutinized by millions of people across the country. The stakes were no longer just about locating a missing local citizen. The stakes now involved a highly coordinated, violent attack on the immediate family of a major public figure. Local news outlets quickly confirm that this discarded piece of fabric contains the suspect's actual genetic material. This terrifying revelation forced the authorities to immediately reconsider the entire behavioral profile of the unknown suspect. This was highly unlikely to be a random, opportunistic burglary gone terribly wrong. This felt intensely like a sophisticated, heavily premeditated operation aimed specifically at a high-value target. With the crushing pressure of the national media bearing down heavily on them, the forensic technicians carefully stepped inside the completely undamaged front door to process the internal crime scene. According to trusted law enforcement sources who spoke directly to News Nation, the interior of the massive house presented the most shocking forensic paradox of the entire investigation. The inside of the residence was described as absolutely perfect. Every single piece of furniture was exactly in its proper place. There were no overturned chairs in the dining room. There were no broken lamps scattered across the living room floor. The heavy rugs were completely undisturbed. It is the masked man's only physical forensic blunder. There was absolutely zero physical indication of any violent struggle taking place anywhere inside the carefully decorated rooms. The pristine, immaculate condition of the interior environment deeply disturbed the seasoned investigators. When an armed attacker violently forces an 84-year-old woman out of her secure home, there is always massive chaos. People desperately fight back. People grab onto heavy door frames. People knock over tables in the dark. A physical struggle inevitably leaves a massive, undeniable trail of structural disruption. But the inside of the Guthrie home was entirely silent and completely immaculate. This creates a terrifying investigative dead end. We know for an absolute fact, officially confirmed by the Associated Press, that there was zero forced entry on the exterior of the house. We know, based on internal sources, that the interior was completely untouched. Yet, we clearly have the victim's confirmed blood pooling on the concrete of the front porch. These three firmly established facts simply do not logically coexist in a normal criminal event. The authorities finally possess the biological evidence they desperately need to unmask the shadow standing on the porch. If the heavy doors were never broken and the inside of the house shows absolutely zero signs of a physical fight, how did the perpetrator successfully force an 84-year-old woman out of her secure environment to ultimately attack her on the outside porch? This immaculate interior completely shatters the typical home invasion theory. The suspect did not smash a glass window and drag her screaming from her bedroom. The pristine nature of the rooms strongly suggests a level of predator control that is almost impossible to comprehend. Did the attacker somehow possess a working key to simply walk in and quietly subdue her before she could ever react? Or did the suspect utilize a deeply psychological tactic? Did he somehow convince an incredibly cautious elderly woman to voluntarily unlock her own heavy front door and step out into the dark desert night to directly face her violent attacker? This is the massive, terrifying question hanging heavily over the bloodstained porch. But when the Federal Bureau of Investigation takes that exact genetic sequence into their advanced laboratory, do you personally think this was someone she knew who already possessed a key? Or an incredibly professional stranger who knew exactly how to psychologically manipulate the physical crime scene? Please leave your detailed theory in the comments section down below. The sheer complexity of the crime scene and the massive national attention demanded an immediate escalation of resources. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos officially partnered with the Federal Bureau of Investigation to tackle the highly sophisticated nature of the abduction. The local deputies had the vital knowledge of the desert terrain, while the federal agents brought the massive technological infrastructure required to process complex digital evidence. The Joint Task Force immediately focused their combined efforts on the only piece of objective truth they possessed. They turned their attention to the digital eye watching over the property. The residential security cameras had captured the exact moment the nightmare began. The video footage showed a chilling sequence of events unfolding in the dead of night. The truth they uncover is infinitely more terrifying than a simple forced entry. At exactly 2:12 in the morning, a dark figure stepped into the frame. The suspect was heavily masked, intentionally obscuring any identifying facial features from the digital lens. The footage clearly showed that the intruder was armed, confirming the violent intent behind the midnight visit. The Forensic Video Analysis Unit at the FBI headquarters meticulously processed every single frame of that brief recording. They stabilized the grainy images, enhanced the low light resolution, and aggressively analyzed every pixel of the suspect's clothing and gear. They were desperately looking for a specific brand logo, a unique wear pattern, or any tiny physical detail that could help them build a functional profile of the attacker. The dark clothing was incredibly generic and offered virtually no solid investigative leads. However, the federal analysts eventually found a massive breakthrough by focusing intensely on the suspect's load-bearing equipment. Slung over the masked man's shoulder was a very specific black bag. Welcome to Seth's Crime Vault. This is the place where we lock away the baseless internet rumors and meticulously decode the actual forensic files. By carefully measuring the dimensions in the video and comparing the strap configurations to known commercial databases, the FBI definitively identified the exact make and model. The suspect was carrying an Ozark Trail hiker pack, specifically identified as the 25-liter version. This was an incredible piece of forensic intelligence. This was not a highly specialized piece of military tactical gear or a custom-made piece of equipment that could be easily traced to a specific niche manufacturer. This was a mass-produced consumer item. More importantly, the Ozark Trail brand is sold absolutely exclusively at Walmart retail locations. This single confirmed fact completely altered the geographic and socioeconomic profile of the entire investigation. The highly disciplined Phantom, who managed to execute a flawless extraction without breaking a single pane of glass, was carrying a budget-friendly backpack purchased from the largest big box retailer in the country. The Joint Task Force immediately launched a massive data collection effort based entirely on this new piece of evidence. If you want to dive deep into criminal psychology and verified investigative evidence, you need to subscribe right now. We only follow the verified facts. The federal agents began the grueling process of cross-referencing thousands of retail purchase records across the entire region. They were frantically searching for anyone who had recently purchased that exact 25-liter black backpack in the weeks leading up to the violent abduction. They scrubbed through credit card transactions, reviewed hundreds of hours of store surveillance footage, and analyzed cash register receipts. But the sheer scale of the retail operation quickly became a massive investigative nightmare. The Ozark Trail 25-liter backpack is an incredibly common, widely available item. Thousands of these specific bags are sold to the general public every single month. Tracking a relatively inexpensive consumer good through a massive national retail network is the absolute definition of looking for a needle in an impossibly large haystack. Every single college student walking across a campus, every weekend hiker exploring the local trails, and every commuter carrying that specific black bag suddenly became a potential data point that had to be manually verified and cleared by an exhausted investigator. The local detectives were practically drowning in a sea of useless retail receipts. This specific case is a perfect example of how a single microscopic biological error can completely alter the trajectory of a massive federal investigation. The visual evidence provided by the doorbell camera was simultaneously the absolute best investigative lead and the most frustrating dead end imaginable. The camera footage undeniably proved that the suspect existed in the physical world, but the mass market nature of his equipment offered absolutely no clear, direct path to uncovering his true identity. The investigation was rapidly burning through critical time, and the authorities could not simply knock on the door of every single person who bought a $20 bag at Walmart. They desperately needed something far more specific than a common retail purchase. They needed the suspect to have made a genuine physical mistake during his escape. They needed an absolute, undeniable biological link that could cut through the noise of mass-produced consumer goods. They needed DNA. The agonizing delay in identifying the perpetrator created a massive informational vacuum that was rapidly filled by a toxic wave of online speculation. Armchair detectives and unauthorized commentators began dissecting the lives of the immediate relatives, fabricating wild theories regarding financial motives and hidden domestic disputes. The physical evidence left behind in the dark desert landscape is completely contradictory. The digital harassment reached such a critical level that the lead official overseeing the entire operation was forced to take an unprecedented public stance. The top law enforcement officer officially addressed the media explicitly to defend the close family members. He firmly categorized the relatives as secondary casualties of this horrendous event, aggressively demanding an immediate end to the baseless public accusations. This highly unusual intervention was absolutely necessary because the relentless digital noise was actively threatening to derail the legitimate investigative momentum. If you appreciate documentary coverage that actively dismantles internet rumors and focuses purely on verified law enforcement documents, please like this video so we can continue bringing you objective analysis. The authorities desperately needed the public to focus on reality because a genuine physical breakthrough had finally occurred out in the arid landscape. While the digital world was obsessed with family drama, physical search teams had been systematically widening their operational grid outward from the pristine residential perimeter. They understood that an assailant carrying a heavy physical burden could not sustain a long-distance escape on foot. A vehicle was absolutely necessary. By carefully mapping the most logical vehicular escape routes leading away from the affluent neighborhood toward the major arterial highways, he is fully masked and moves with terrifying purpose. We have a suspect who appears boldly on a security camera, but seemingly vanishes into thin air. The search coordinators concentrated their personnel on the dusty shoulders of the outbound roads. Exactly 2 miles away from the initial location, their methodical ground search yielded a monumental piece of forensic treasure. Discarded carelessly in the roadside brush was a single piece of protective handwear. The investigators immediately secured the area, treating the small patch of dirt as a secondary crime scene of immense value. Preliminary laboratory testing quickly confirmed the presence of biological material trapped within the synthetic fibers of the recovered item. This was the exact physical mistake the profiling units had been desperately hoping for. The authorities finally possessed a tangible piece of genetic evidence that was highly likely to belong directly to the individual who executed the midnight extraction. The entire momentum of the task force shifted dramatically from analyzing retail supply chains to processing molecular structures. The local laboratory technicians carefully isolated the biological sample and prepared it for immediate entry into the National Federal Database. The anticipation within the command center was absolutely palpable. To completely understand how this phantom managed to bypass every advanced security measure, we must look very closely at the target he chose. A solid match in the Federal Registry would instantaneously provide a legal name, a known photograph, and a detailed criminal history. It would finally bridge the agonizing gap between a grainy surveillance silhouette and a real human suspect. The agents were banking heavily on the logical assumption that an individual capable of executing such a meticulous and disciplined abduction would inevitably have prior interactions with the justice system. The clinical profile strongly suggested deep experience, and criminal experience almost always leaves a permanent bureaucratic paper trail. As the cellular sample was processed by the advanced sequencing machines, the tactical deployment teams began preparing their heavy gear for an imminent raid. They fully anticipated receiving a confirmed identity and a residential address within a matter of hours. The recovery of the discarded item felt like the definitive turning point in a crisis that had been utterly opaque. The perpetrator had successfully bypassed the expensive residential alarms and maintained absolute silence within the target structure, but he had failed to secure his own biological payload during the chaotic adrenaline rush of the vehicular getaway. We need to examine the highly specific vulnerabilities that made this crime possible. The cellular material extracted from the fabric was described as high quality, meaning it had not been hopelessly degraded by the harsh environmental conditions of the desert exposure. It was a robust sample, fully capable of yielding a complete and undeniable genetic profile. The anticipation was not merely about finding a suspect to close a file. It was about finding a crucial leverage point to locate a highly vulnerable elderly citizen who was rapidly running out of time. The scientific process was the ultimate, infallible arbiter of truth in an environment that had been deeply plagued by media, deception, and dead ends. The dedicated task force investigators practically held their breath as the national system began aggressively churning through its vast archives of convicted felons and previously arrested individuals. The sheer weight of the impending scientific revelation was overwhelming for the exhausted detectives who had been working around the clock since the initial emergency call. They were simply waiting for the monitor to blink with a confirmed hit to finally unmask the shadow that had shattered the peace of the community. But the scientific results were about to plunge the entire operation into an even deeper layer of impenetrable darkness. The answer begins with a life that was deeply tethered to strict medical routines. The advanced laboratory machinery completed its exhaustive comparative analysis and returned a completely devastating verdict. The robust genetic profile extracted directly from the recovered fabric did not trigger a single match anywhere within the massive federal database. The biological signature belonged to an absolute ghost. This chilling revelation meant the individual responsible had never been previously arrested, had never been convicted of a felony offense, and had successfully managed to completely evade the structural net of the national justice system for his entire. The sheer horror of this unexpected result cannot be overstated. The authorities were not dealing with a known quantity or a documented repeat offender. They were hunting a completely operational phantom. This catastrophic analytical dead end forced the specialized behavioral teams to violently reevaluate the entire framework of the crime. This terrified realization brought the investigation crashing back into the central contradictions of the case, specifically the highly publicized financial demands that had been aggressively circulating in the media. The profound anomaly of Nancy Guthrie's daily existence is completely central to understanding the forensic reality of this terrifying case. While the physical search teams were dealing with the genetic failure, the specialized cyber units were finally untangling the complex web of the digital extortion attempts. When federal digital analysts dug aggressively into the encrypted metadata of the messages sent to the entertainment websites, the terrifying illusion began to shatter. The sophisticated ransom demand was entirely exposed as a cruel, opportunistic fraud. Law enforcement officially arrested a man named Derek Kalela, entirely separate from the physical kidnapping, who had merely watched the breaking news coverage regarding the famous television anchor. This opportunistic scammer had maliciously weaponized the public tragedy for his own financial gain, crafting a highly convincing fake demand to exploit the terrified family and manipulate the panicked authorities. The digital trail was a brilliantly executed mirage that had successfully siphoned thousands of critical man hours away from the physical reality of the desert terrain. With the digital distraction effectively neutralized and the perpetrator confirmed to be a completely different person, the harsh truth of the physical crime scene roared back into focus. She was 84 years old and lived entirely alone in a sprawling residence nestled deeply in the affluent Catalina Foothills. The investigators were left staring at the terrifying concept of predator manipulation to explain the lack of interior damage. If the attacker was not a known associate with a key, and he did not utilize brute force to break the external glass, how did he extract the resident? The pristine interior combined with the violent exterior evidence proves that the violence was surgically contained to the outdoor threshold. The perpetrator did not violently enter the structure to hunt his target. He utilized an unknown psychological tactic to draw the cautious victim out into the fatal zone of the front steps. This level of behavioral discipline is almost never seen in amateur offenders. It implies extensive operational rehearsal and a chilling emotional detachment from the act of violence. He controlled the environment perfectly, manipulating the situation so the elderly victim would open her own heavy front door in the middle of the night. The absolute failure of the National Genetic Database only amplified this terrifying psychological profile. Mentally, she was exceptionally sharp. She possessed total cognitive clarity, maintained full awareness of her complex surroundings, and actively managed her own affairs. We are looking directly at an individual who possesses the operational discipline to execute a rapid extraction, the situational awareness to avoid internal security measures, and the sheer luck to remain entirely unblemished in the criminal justice system. The realization that the extortion demands were a secondary layer of fraud meant the true underlying motive for the physical abduction remained completely shrouded in darkness. If he did not want millions in digital currency, what was the actual objective of taking her into the night? The authorities were suddenly operating completely blind. They had no known motive, no identified suspect, and absolutely no functional genetic lead to follow. The Phantom had successfully outmaneuvered both the physical search grids and the digital dragnets. The entire law enforcement apparatus was essentially paralyzed by the clinical perfection of the initial strike. The sheer magnitude of this investigative collapse sent devastating shockwaves through the command center. They had utilized the most advanced forensic tools available to modern science, and every single highly technological avenue had led them directly into a solid concrete wall. The realization that a highly dangerous criminal can execute such a flawless tactical maneuver and still completely bypass the sophisticated federal databases deeply unsettled the entire community. However, her physical body was permanently anchored to a highly rigid and unforgiving daily schedule of necessary survival tools. The invisible safety net that citizens naturally assume will protect them had completely failed to catch this specific predator. If you are captivated by this intricate breakdown of the verified evidence and the unraveling of the forensic paradox, make sure you turn on your notification bell right now to stay updated on the latest developments in these incredibly complex federal case files. The stark reality of the present moment is deeply sobering for everyone involved in the massive search effort. Despite the unprecedented deployment of federal resources and the intense, unyielding scrutiny of the national media apparatus, the elderly matriarch remains completely missing. The relentless passage of time is the absolute greatest enemy in any abduction scenario, but when the victim requires highly specialized daily medication to sustain vital cardiovascular function, the chronological window for a positive medical outcome closes with terrifying speed. The family continues to broadcast desperate, emotional pleas across every available television network, utilizing their considerable public platform to intentionally keep the face of their loved one in the national consciousness. They are fighting a grueling, exhausting war of attrition against the rapidly fading attention span of the 24-hour news cycle. She was fundamentally dependent on an internal implanted pacemaker and a highly specific timed regimen of vital daily medications. Meanwhile, the investigation, severely battered by false digital leads and genetic dead ends, has been forced to fundamentally pivot its core operational strategy. The heavy reliance on advanced technological solutions has been temporarily shelved out of pure necessity. The federal agents have painfully recognized that complex computer algorithms and automated database queries simply cannot solve this specific human puzzle. The operation has drastically shifted back to the grueling historical fundamentals of manual detective work. They call this arduous process shoe leather sleuthing. The Joint Task Force is aggressively circulating the stabilized surveillance images of the mass market backpack and the mask silhouette to every single commercial corner of the region. They are no longer waiting for a multi-million-dollar laboratory computer to magically provide the definitive answer. They are actively begging the general public for a fragmented memory. They desperately need a retail clerk who vaguely remembers a cash transaction for a dark bag. This exact medical reality is precisely why the initial hours of this federal investigation are so critically important for you to understand. They need a late-night commuter who casually noticed a strange vehicle idling on the dusty shoulder of a desert highway in the early morning hours. They need a transient worker who might have stumbled upon discarded medical supplies in a remote ravine. This massive regression to basic community canvassing highlights the profound limitations of modern forensic science. A state-of-the-art laboratory facility is rendered completely useless if the perpetrator simply refuses to participate in the established criminal ecosystem. The authorities are now entirely dependent on the incredibly fragile, notoriously unreliable nature of human recollection. They are heavily relying on the statistical probability that someone somewhere saw something highly unusual that they simply did not realize was crucial to an active federal investigation. This is an incredibly vulnerable position for professional law enforcement to occupy. The massive technological apparatus of the government has been thoroughly humbled by a localized, remarkably disciplined physical crime. The agonizingly frustrating truth is that the answers are not hidden deeply in the dark web or encrypted within a complex digital ledger. He executes a seemingly flawless abduction in the absolute dead of night. An elderly woman whose very heartbeat relies on synchronized cardiovascular technology absolutely does not decide to take a spontaneous. The answers are currently sitting quietly in the physical memories of everyday citizens who might have walked past the suspect in a brightly lit retail aisle or drove past his vehicle on a dark road. The entire weight of the federal inquiry now rests on the desperate hope of a single localized witness coming forward with the missing piece of the narrative. But a lingering, deeply terrifying question remains permanently attached to the perfectly undisturbed interior of that upscale house. If the unknown attacker was remarkably capable of bypassing the external alarms and extracting the cautious resident without causing a single internal disturbance, what else is this ghost currently capable of executing? The chilling lack of physical damage inside the massive home strongly indicates that the perpetrator had studied the specific layout and routines for a significant period before making his tactical approach. He mapped the blind spots and timed his strike perfectly to avoid any internal sensors, without knowing exactly why the elderly resident was targeted and taken into the desert night. Unannounced, walk into the harsh desert terrain in the middle of the night. It is completely impossible for the behavioral analysts to accurately predict the suspect's next potential move or ascertain the ultimate fate of the highly vulnerable victim. The local community remains completely trapped in a constant state of indefinite anxiety, knowing that a highly capable predator is operating completely undetected within their immediate region, unbound by any known criminal history. What this case teaches us about the deeply ingrained myth of the perfect forensic net is profoundly disturbing. The general public has been thoroughly conditioned by popular television procedurals to believe in the absolute infallibility of the crime scene investigation effect. We collectively assume that recovering cellular material at a physical location is the immediate equivalent of magically solving the entire mystery. However, this specific investigation serves as a brutal educational reminder of a glaring legal reality. Genetic material is not a magical key. If an individual does not already exist within the established national registry, either through a prior felony conviction or a previous mandated sample collection, their biological signature is absolutely nothing more than a string of anonymous chemical code. It provides zero actionable intelligence regarding their legal name or their current geographic location. She does not wander off the property and simply lose her way. Furthermore, this terrifying incident exposes a catastrophic structural flaw in how we perceive community safety and criminal justice. A completely unknown offender operating entirely outside the known parameters of the legal system can successfully execute an operation of immensely high complexity. They can leave behind a glaring physical error, a completely intact genetic profile, yet still walk effortlessly through the massive technological filters specifically designed to protect society. This active case perfectly demonstrates that the most dangerous predators are not necessarily the ones with the longest criminal records. The truly terrifying threats are the complete blank slates, the highly disciplined individuals who exist quietly on the absolute margins of society, entirely invisible to the algorithms and databases until the exact moment they decide to violently strike, Their complete lack of documented history becomes their ultimate tactical advantage against a system that relies entirely on past behavior to accurately predict future violence. We are forced to confront the chilling reality that our most advanced investigative safety nets have massive, glaring holes. The physical piece of fabric dropped carelessly in the desert dirt currently remains securely locked inside a strictly temperature-controlled federal evidence freezer. The absolute, pristine, undeniable genetic code of the masked attacker is perfectly preserved in a glass vial, silently waiting for a future mistake. The absolute necessity of her prescribed medication completely eliminates any working theory of a voluntary disappearance or sudden mental confusion. The dedicated authorities are essentially playing an agonizing long-term game of chronological roulette. They are desperately hoping that the unidentified suspect eventually gets arrested for a simple, minor traffic violation or a careless petty theft that finally mandates a routine biological swab. Until that highly unpredictable bureaucratic moment actually occurs, the vast national system will never trigger the crucial alert. The highly disciplined shadow who stood patiently on the porch that night remains a completely free ghost, walking comfortably among the unsuspecting general public. How long do you think an individual with this extreme level of predatory control can realistically go before making their second critical physical mistake? Please do not forget to immediately subscribe to Seth's Crime Vault and turn on your notifications so you never miss our next deep forensic case file breakdown. We will see you all back down in the dark evidence archives very soon. If she physically leaves that secure property, she absolutely has to be violently forced. Furthermore, physically controlling an 84-year-old victim who requires constant heart monitoring without immediately causing a fatal medical event requires an intense level of criminal calculation. The perpetrator cannot simply drag her through the dirt. The perpetrator must carefully maintain a highly delicate balance of psychological terror and physical stability to ensure the fragile victim actually survives the initial extraction process. This terrifying level of required physical precision makes the specific environment she lived in even more significant to the case. The Catalina Foothills neighborhood is designed specifically for maximum privacy, deep isolation, and perceived security. He manages to extract an 84-year-old woman from her heavily secured home without triggering a single neighborhood alarm. The massive houses are separated by incredibly wide stretches of natural arid landscaping. The entire community is built explicitly on the promise of quiet safety away from the chaotic noise of the city streets. Her large home was an established fortress of comfortable, predictable routine. She spent her days carefully managing her health and staying closely connected with her family members through various digital platforms. Her daily environment was totally predictable. Every single solid door and reinforced window was a physical barrier meant to keep the unpredictable, violent elements of the outside world safely at bay. She had loving family members consistently checking in on her well-being. She had advanced medical devices actively monitoring her vital signs around the clock. She was constantly surrounded by these invisible, reassuring safety nets. But those exact same sophisticated safety nets inadvertently created a profound, hidden vulnerability. The deep physical isolation of the highly affluent neighborhood meant that if a targeted threat somehow successfully breached the exterior perimeter, it is a chilling display of tactical control. There would be absolutely no immediate visual witnesses. There are no casual pedestrians walking by at 2 in the morning to notice a suspicious vehicle. There are no close neighbors awake to hear a sudden, sharp noise on the concrete front steps. The heavy architectural walls, explicitly designed to offer premium privacy, also offered the absolute perfect acoustic cover for a highly motivated predator. The expensive security systems and the perfectly quiet streets were supposed to guarantee absolute, unbreakable peace of mind. But for an 84-year-old woman living entirely alone, completely dependent on the rhythmic ticking of a medical device, the heavy, suffocating silence of that sprawling house was never a true protective shield. It was a perfectly designed, deeply isolated trap just waiting to be sprung. The illusion of that secure environment shattered completely on a quiet Sunday morning. Nancy Guthrie had a strictly established routine of attending an online church service every single weekend. The perpetrator leaves no immediate physical trace at the property line to identify himself. For someone whose life was carefully structured around medical alarms and digital connections, missing a scheduled virtual event was a massive, immediate anomaly. When she failed to log on for the Sunday morning service, her family instantly knew something was catastrophically wrong. They did not wait for hours to see if she would eventually call them back. They did not assume she was simply sleeping late. They understood the severe medical stakes involved and immediately contacted the local authorities to report her missing. This rapid response is exactly why the police arrived at the Catalina Foothills property so quickly. The responding officers initially approached the large residence expecting a routine medical welfare check. They likely assumed they would find an elderly resident who had suffered a sudden fall or a severe cardiac event inside the home. But the reality waiting for them at the front door instantly escalated the situation from a standard medical call to a major crime scene. Right there on the concrete front porch, the officers found highly disturbing physical evidence. There was blood. But even the most disciplined predators make physical mistakes in the chaotic aftermath of a crime. The crimson stains were clearly visible against the pathway leading directly to the front entrance. Subsequent forensic testing officially confirmed a terrifying reality. The blood found on the porch belonged directly to Nancy Guthrie. A single small drop of blood outside a home might be explained away as a minor domestic accident, perhaps a scraped knee or a cut finger while gardening. But a significant pooling of blood, combined directly with the total physical disappearance of a woman who physically cannot walk long distances, points to only one grim conclusion. This was a violent, targeted abduction. The immediate presence of her confirmed blood on the exterior threshold of the property triggered massive alarms across the entire police department. The primary question for the first responders was no longer where the victim had wandered off to. The central burning question was exactly how the perpetrator managed to get their hands on her in the first place. Exactly 2 miles away from the quiet residence, search teams make a critical discovery discarded in the dirt. It is a single glove. The authorities rapidly established a tight perimeter around the sprawling house and began a meticulous examination of the exterior walls. They were desperately searching for the exact point of breach. They looked for shattered window glass on the desert landscaping. They looked for heavy pry marks on the solid door frames. They looked for disabled security panels or cut electrical wires. They needed to understand the specific tactical entry method used by the attacker to bypass the heavy locks. A violent home invasion that results in a bloody extraction usually leaves a massive trail of structural damage. Criminals typically use brute force to gain rapid access to their targets. But the deputies walking the perimeter of the Catalina Foothills home found absolutely nothing. Every single window was perfectly intact. Every exterior door was completely secure and showed absolutely zero signs of forced entry. You wear heavy gloves during a home invasion to guarantee you do not leave your fingerprints on a door handle. The physical integrity of the house was completely uncompromised. This massive contradiction immediately halted the initial investigative momentum. Law enforcement was staring at the verified blood of an 84-year-old missing woman on the front porch, yet the house itself stood completely unbroken. How does an attacker forcefully remove a heavily dependent, frail woman from a locked fortress without leaving a single scratch on the exterior doors? Did the suspect somehow possess a specialized key to bypass the deadbolts? Did they utilize sophisticated tools to silently pick the locks in the dead of night? Or is there a much more sinister explanation for the lack of structural damage? The blood was undeniably there, demanding immediate answers, but the silent, undamaged house refused to yield any obvious clues. The investigators had to carefully step over the blood-stained concrete and move their search into the interior of the residence.